Morning, my nephew showed up with a moving truck. I was drinking my second cup of coffee on the back porch, watching the cardinals at the feeder my wife Dorothy had hung up the summer before she passed. I didn't hear him pull in. I only heard the truck's air brakes hiss from the driveway. And I actually thought that maybe a delivery had come to the wrong address. We get that sometimes out here in Flagstaff. Neighbors 3 doors down order something and the driver punches in the wrong house number. So I set down my mug, walked through the kitchen, opened the front door, and there he was. My nephew Devon, 34 years old, wearing a brand new flannel shirt I'd never seen before, standing next to a woman I barely recognized as his girlfriend Tessa, and behind them, two men in grey t-shirts were already pulling the loading ramp down from the back of the truck. He had the nerve to smile at me. "Morning, Uncle Felix," he said. "This is going to go a lot smoother if you just step aside. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed civil engineer for the state of Arizona. I have reviewed contracts, filed easements, testified in court cases about property boundaries, and read more legal documents than most people will see in 3 lifetimes. I say this not to brag. I say this because you need to understand that when my nephew smiled at me that morning, I already knew something was deeply, profoundly wrong. And I was already thinking 3 steps ahead of him. I said, "Devin, what exactly do you think you're doing?" He reached into the front pocket of that new flannel shirt and pulled out a folded set of papers, held them out like he was serving me dinner. "Got a deed right here," he said. "Transferred into my name. County recorded it 2 weeks ago. You've had plenty of time to make arrangements." I did not take the papers from his hand. I just looked at him for a long moment. The gardeners were still singing from the backyard. The morning was so quiet and clear it almost hurt. "Come inside," I said. He shook his head. "We're not doing this inside, Uncle Felix. We've already talked to a lawyer. You don't have any, Devon." I kept my voice completely level. "Come inside." Something in my tone made him hesitate. He glanced at Tessa. She gave him a little nod like she was coaching him, and he followed me into the house. I want to back up, because what happened that morning didn't begin that morning. It began 18 months earlier, on a Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after I buried Dorothy. Dorothy and I had been married 41 years. We met at the University of Arizona, got married young, raised 2 boys, both of whom live out of state now, one in Oregon, one in Georgia. We never had a daughter. We always said we didn't need one because Dorothy was enough for both of us. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept a bowl of wrapped candy on the entryway table for anyone who walked through the door, who spent Saturday mornings making tamales from a recipe her grandmother had taught her, even though she was the only non-Mexican woman any of us had ever seen who could do it right. When she died, I went very quiet for a long time. Devon's mother, my sister Connie, called me every few days those first weeks. She lives up in Colorado, couldn't travel much because of her knee, but she called. Devon started coming by about a month in. He'd grown up 40 minutes from Flagstaff and had always been close to our family. As a kid, he used to help me in the garage, hand me tools, ask questions about how things worked. I always had a soft spot for him. When he started stopping by after Dorothy died, I appreciated it. I genuinely did. He'd come on Saturday afternoons, sometimes bring groceries, sometimes just sit with me on the back porch and watch the yard. We'd talk about Dorothy, about the old days, about his dad who'd passed a few years before. It felt like grief was something we shared. I trusted that. The paperwork started showing up in month 3. "I've been talking to a financial advisor," Devin told me one afternoon. "Uncle Felix, you've got a lot of equity in this house. And with the market the way it is, it's just sitting there. I want to help you make it work for you." I'll be honest with you. I wasn't at my sharpest that fall. I was sleeping badly. I had stopped cooking real meals. I went entire weeks without leaving the property except for groceries. The grief had done something to my concentration that I hadn't expected. I'd been a precise, methodical person my entire career, and suddenly I was forgetting appointments, leaving the stove on, losing my reading glasses 3 times a day. Devin knew that. I think he'd been watching it carefully. The first document he brought me was something he called a property management agreement. He said it would allow him to handle routine maintenance issues on the house on my behalf, schedule repairs, deal with contractors, things I'd been putting off. He said it was temporary, just while I was getting back on my feet. I read it. I wasn't so far gone that I didn't read it. But I'll admit that my reading wasn't what it used to be. The language was dense in the way legal documents always are, and I skimmed sections I should have read line by line. I signed it. That was my mistake. Not my only mistake, but the first one. Over the next few months, Devon brought me 3 more documents. Each one was presented casually, tucked into a regular visit, slipped in between conversations about football and family, and how I was eating. He always had a simple explanation. This one just updates the previous one. This one is for insurance purposes. This one clarifies the property address for county records. I signed 2 of them. The third one I set aside and said I'd look at it more carefully. Devin didn't push. He just nodded, refilled my coffee, changed the subject. That third document sat on my desk for 6 weeks. The reason I finally looked at it carefully wasn't instinct or suspicion. It was Dorothy. I know how that sounds, but I had a dream about her. Vivid in the way grief dreams sometimes are, where you wake up and the light in the room looks different. In the dream, she was standing at the kitchen table and she was looking at a stack of papers and she said, without looking up, "Felix, you need to read this." I woke up at 5 in the morning and I went to my desk and I read that third document from the first word to the last. It was a quitclaim deed. For those who don't know, a quitclaim deed transfers ownership of a property from one person to another. It's the same instrument used in divorces, estate transfers, between family members. It requires this signature of the person giving up the property, and it requires notarization. My signature was on it, and there was a notary stamp. But I had never signed a quitclaim deed, and I had never sat across from a notary for anything related to this house. I put the document down on the desk, and I sat very still for about 10 minutes. Then I called my attorney. His name is Richard Oakes. I've worked with him for 20 years, since back when I was dealing with county contracts and right-of-way disputes and the occasional lawsuit that comes with engineering work on public infrastructure. Richard is the kind of lawyer who picks up on the second ring and never makes you feel like you're wasting his time. I told him everything. I read him the document over the phone. He was quiet for a moment. "Felix," he said, "don't sign anything else. Don't speak to Devin about this, and get me the originals of everything you signed." I asked him what he thought we were dealing with. He said, "I think someone forged your signature on a real estate transfer, and if they got it notarized, that's a second crime. Give me 48 hours." I gave him 48 hours. I spent those 2 days acting completely normal. I did not call Devon. I did not call my sister. I went through my desk and found every document I'd signed over the previous 8 months and put them in a folder. I also went through my filing cabinet and pulled out every document related to the house. The original deed from 1987, the mortgage payoff from 2004, the property tax records going back 15 years. I made copies of everything and put the copies in a separate envelope that I gave to my neighbor Judith to hold for me. Richard called me back on Thursday morning. He'd already spoken to the county recorder's office. The quitclaim deed had been filed. Devin's name was now on record as the owner of my house. But here's what Richard also found. The notary stamp on the document belonged to a woman who had let her notary commission lapse 14 months earlier. She was a friend of Tessa's, Devin's girlfriend, and the signature on the deed that was supposed to be mine didn't match the signature I'd given Richard from the original documents. It didn't match. "How obvious is the difference?" I asked. "To the naked eye, Felix, it's pretty good. But it's not yours. I can see it in the X of your last name. You cross it differently. You always have. I remember sitting down in Dorothy's chair when he said that. The one by the window where she used to read. I hadn't sat in it since she died. I sat in it then. I asked Richard what we needed to do. He said, "We need to go to the Coconino County Sheriff's Office." Today, we did. I will not pretend that walking into that building and telling a detective that my own nephew had forged my signature and stolen my house was easy. It was one of the hardest things I've done in a life that has had a few hard things in it. The detective, a woman named Sergeant Valdez, who had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who has heard every version of human betrayal, took my statement for nearly 2 hours. She examined the documents. She photographed everything. She told me not to do anything that would alert Devin to the investigation. That was November. The next 4 months were the quietest, strangest months of my life. I saw Devin twice during that time. Once at Thanksgiving, when we all went to Connie's in Colorado and sat around a table and ate turkey, and I watched my nephew laugh and tell stories and felt something I can only describe as cold. Not anger exactly. Something older and more settled than anger. The knowledge that what was coming was already in motion and he had no idea. The second time was in January, when he stopped by with Tessa and a bottle of wine just to check in. I made them coffee. We sat in the living room. Tessa kept looking around the house, the way you look at something you've already decided belongs to you. I offered her more coffee. She said yes, and I said absolutely nothing about any of it. By February, the Coconino County Sheriff's Office had built a case. Sergeant Valdez had tracked down Tessa's friend, the lapse notary, who, when faced with the evidence against her, made the decision that most people make when they realize they're about to be charged as an accomplice to felony fraud. She cooperated. She told investigators that Devin had approached her 8 months earlier, that he had brought her a document and a signature page and asked her to stamp it, that he had told her it was a family arrangement his uncle had already agreed to and just hadn't gotten around to signing himself, that she had known it was wrong and done it anyway, because Devin had given her $300 and she needed the money. $300. That was what she was paid to help steal a house that I had built my life in for 37 years. They arrested Devin on a Thursday morning in late February. I know this because Sergeant Valdez called me the night before to let me know it was happening and to thank me for my patience during the investigation. I thanked her back, and then I sat on the back porch with a glass of good bourbon and looked at the dark yard for a long time. The cardinals were somewhere sleeping. The feeder was empty. I made a note to refill it in the morning. But let me tell you about the morning he came with the moving truck, because all of that, the investigation, the arrest, the months of waiting, that was what came after. What I want to tell you about is the morning itself, because that is when I understood the full shape of what my nephew had become. He followed me inside that morning. Tessa waited in the driveway, arms crossed, watching the two movers wait by the truck. Devin sat down at the kitchen table like he'd sat there 1,000 times before. And he had. He really had. And he set the papers down between us. "Uncle Felix," he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "I know this is hard. I know you loved this house. But it's mine now. The county has it recorded. You need to have your things out by end of day." I looked at him across the table where Dorothy and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 4 decades. I said, "Devin, do you know what a lis pendens is?" He blinked. "What? A lis pendens? It's a legal notice filed against a property that is subject to active litigation. It essentially freezes the title. No sale, no transfer, no occupancy change can be completed on a property with a lis pendens attached until the underlying matter is resolved in court." He was quiet. "My attorney filed one 4 months ago," I said. "The day after I went to the sheriff's office." Something changed in his face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a collapse. It was more like watching something drain slowly out of a person. The color, the certainty, the script he'd been rehearsing. You went to the I also want you to know, I said, that the woman who notarized that deed, Tessa's friend, she's already given a full statement to investigators, and that the signature on the quitclaim deed does not match mine. Richard can show you 17 specific points of difference. Devin opened his mouth. Don't, I said. Not loud, not angry, just final. I picked up the papers he'd laid on the table and I set them on the counter without looking at them. You should go, I said, and you should call a lawyer, a real one, not whoever told you this scheme was going to work. He stood up slowly. He looked around the kitchen the way a person looks around a place they know they're seen for the last time. He looked at Dorothy's cardinal feeder through the window above the sink. He looked at the shelf where she kept her ceramic rooster collection. He looked at me. He didn't say he was sorry. I didn't expect him to. He walked out the front door. I heard Tessa's voice, sharp, questioning, and then his voice, lower, and then two car doors, and then the truck pulling out of the driveway. I poured my coffee down the sink because it had gone completely cold. I made a fresh pot. I refilled the cardinal feeder. I called Richard and told him Devin had come by. Richard said good, that was all documented, and told me the criminal case was moving forward and to sit tight. The trial took 6 months. I sat in that courtroom for 4 days of testimony. I'm not a dramatic person, never have been, but I'll tell you that sitting 12 feet away from my nephew while a prosecutor laid out exactly what he'd done and why was something I will carry for the rest of my life, not with bitterness. I'm past bitterness, with a kind of deep, permanent sadness for the boy who used to sit in my garage asking me how engines worked. Devin was convicted of felony deed fraud and forgery. Under Arizona statute, those charges carried real weight. He was sentenced to 2 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections with an additional 3 years of supervised probation. The lapsed notary, Tessa's friend, received 18 months probation and 200 hours of community service and lost any future eligibility to hold a notary commission. Tessa herself was not charged, though she sat through every day of that trial with an expression I can only describe as someone slowly understanding what kind of person they had been building a life with. I don't know what happened to them after that. I don't need to. My sister Connie called me the night after sentencing. She cried. She said she didn't understand how Devin had become someone capable of this. I told her I didn't fully understand it either, but that grief has a way of showing you who people really are when they think you can't protect yourself. She asked if I could ever forgive him. I thought about Dorothy in that dream, looking at papers on the kitchen table. I thought about the cardinal feeder she'd hung up. I thought about 31 years of measuring things precisely, of learning that the difference between a sound structure and a dangerous one is usually just a few calculations you either do or don't bother to do. I told Connie, I don't know about forgiveness yet, but I'm still in my house, and that's enough for right now. It's been 14 months since the sentencing. I've had the kitchen repainted. Dorothy always wanted it a different shade of yellow, and I finally got around to it. My son from Oregon came out for 2 weeks last summer, brought his kids, and we ate breakfast every morning at that kitchen table. The Cardinals are back. They were always back, I suppose. I just hadn't been watching. I want to say one thing to anyone listening to this who is in a vulnerable season of their life. After a loss, after an illness, after any of the events that can temporarily soften the edges of who you are, read everything. Sign nothing you haven't read 3 times, and keep copies of every document you've ever signed, somewhere someone else can hold onto for you. The people who would take advantage of your grief are counting on the fact that grief makes you tired. They are counting on the fact that you trust them. They are counting on the fact that you're not paying attention the way you usually would. I was tired. I did trust him. I wasn't paying full attention. But Dorothy made sure I woke up in time, and that signature on the X, the one I've had since I first learned to write my name, that was the thing that undid everything Devin thought he'd built. Details matter. They always do. I've thought a lot about what made Devin believe he could pull this off, not the legal mechanics of it. I understand those. I mean, what he believed about me, what he saw when he looked across that kitchen table at a 68-year-old man who'd been eating breakfast alone for 8 months and forgetting where he put his glasses. He saw someone who had already been broken by something else. And he decided that was enough. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the forged signature, not the lapsed notary, not the $300 he paid her. I keep coming back to the moment he made a decision about who I was and got it wrong. Because the cruelest thing about what Devin did wasn't the fraud, it was the assumption underneath it. That grief had made me less. That losing Dorothy had turned me into someone who could be managed, redirected, moved aside like furniture. What he didn't understand, what I think a lot of people don't understand about loss, is that grief doesn't hollow you out permanently. It goes very deep and very dark for a while. And then something in you, some part that was built over decades of showing up and doing careful work and caring about the details, that part comes back. It came back for me at 5 in the morning when I sat down and read that quitclaim deed, word by word. I don't think Devin was born dishonest. I've thought about that too. I remember the kid who sat in my garage and asked good questions. Somewhere between that boy and the man who showed up with a moving truck, something in his character had gone unexercised for too long. The part of a person that says, "This is wrong, I won't do it." That part is like any other part of you. If you don't use it, it gets weak. And when the opportunity came, when he saw what looked like an easy path, he didn't have enough of that muscle left to resist it. That's not a religious idea. It's just true. The choices we make when no one is watching, the small daily decisions about whether we take the honest path or the convenient one, those build something in us, or they don't. And by the time a real test arrives, we find out what we actually built. Felix held on because he'd spent 31 years building the habit of precision. Read it again, check the math, keep the documentation. Those weren't dramatic virtues. They were just the ordinary discipline of someone who had learned that details matter, that cutting corners costs more in the end than doing it right the first time. I'm not going to tell you the story had a clean ending emotionally. It didn't. My sister still struggles with what her son did. I still sit at a kitchen table that holds 41 years of memory and feel the absence of the person who should be across from me. Justice was served, and it didn't fix any of that. But I'm still in my house. The cardinals are still at the feeder Dorothy hung, and I know, with the kind of certainty that only comes from having been tested, that I did not let grief make me into someone I wasn't. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not that bad people always get caught. Sometimes they don't, but that who you are before the hard season is who you'll have to rely on during it. Build that person carefully. Maintain them. Pay attention to the details of your own character the same way you'd pay attention to anything else worth keeping. It matters, especially when you think no one is watching, especially then.